Netanyahu, because of the coalition system and the fragmented party system, is also a master at re-engineering his political options. So that's the main reason why a majority of people who may not trust him can't automatically get rid of him.
Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you beyond the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, I speak with Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin, a Tel Aviv-based political analyst and a Haaretz columnist. Scheindlin also serves as a fellow at Century International and has advised on 8 national Israeli election campaigns over a 20-year period. Together, we discuss the sources of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's staying power, as well as his ongoing efforts to remodel key state institutions. Then I continue the conversation with Ninar, Fawal, and Todman to evaluate how the changes underway in Israel might affect bilateral relations with the United States. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. Dahlia Scheindlin, welcome to Babel.
Thank you for having me.
What's the general mood in Israel right now?
It's a little bit hard to characterize a general mood because Israel is, of course, a very deeply divided society. So what we have is a combination of mass and very energetic and angry protests that have been going on, frankly, since January 2023. But in the ebb and flow of protests have been really resurgent over the last couple of weeks, with new peaks following the announcement of the government and the prime minister that he wants to fire the attorney general and then head of the Shin Bet,
which is the internal security apparatus,
internal security agency, and the stagnation in the hostage release negotiations, which are or aren't happening, depending on which day you talk to the prime minister, who's sowing a great deal of chaos. And so there has been a huge wave of anger and protest. And of course, because of restarting the war, that's backed up by survey research showing that somewhere around 60% of Israelis regularly, every time these questions are asked, believe that the prime minister is making decisions about this war based on his personal political interests, primarily staying in power. And only about a third of Israelis believe that he's making his decisions, whether it's wartime decisions or decisions about the hostages, for those causes themselves. And so that is a very fundamental breakdown of how the majority of Israeli public sees the government and its actions. There's a lot of skepticism. There's a great deal of talk and experiences of officers and high-level figures in the army who are seeing a decline in response rate of reservists responding to their draft orders, and a great concern that if this war simply goes on with no real end in sight, which is what the government appears to be promoting, there will be a real problem with motivation. On the other hand, I have to also mention the roughly 30%, sometimes it's more, 30, 35%, who essentially support most of what this government says and does. And so if you live in that world and you listen just to the prime minister and what he says, Benjamin Netanyahu is convinced that he is the person leading Israel to a better place, fighting to get the hostages back, the warrior against anti-Semitism, the person who can defend Israel against Iran and its axes. And his government, of course, wants to do more and is expansionist and wants to annex Gaza and expel Gazans and rebuild settlements. And there's a core of about 20, 25% who support that too. They are included within the broader 1/3, roughly, who support almost anything this government does. And so from their perspective, as difficult as times may be, they think that the country's doing the right thing. There's always a deep division, but that's the big breakdown.
So I guess the two questions are, first, who are this 1/3 of Israelis who strongly support Netanyahu? The second question related is, why is the other 2/3 that think that he's doing this out of personal advancement so inert, moving Israeli politics into a different direction? Israel is, after all, an electoral democracy.
It is an electoral democracy, but it has already lost its status in one of the gold standard indices of democracy, the VDEM index, of being a liberal democracy. And so, yes, Israelis will be going to the polls. The question is how meaningful those elections will be in a year and a half if the government continues on its program, which is well underway, of trying to intimidate and essentially clip civil society, undermine the viability of organizations that are critical of the government, and the independence of the judiciary, intimidate and constrain independent media. All of those things make it harder to have a serious electoral competition. And of course, if there's no limits on the state, who knows how far the state will go in intimidating protesters and dissenters. There's already lots of examples of police crackdown, et cetera. And a lot can be done in the next year and a half until elections are scheduled. So first of all, let me just say that the fact that a majority is either skeptical of the government's motivations or oppose Netanyahu, or don't trust Netanyahu in various other questions and surveys about trust itself, that doesn't translate into toppling the government. They can't force new elections just because they feel a certain way in surveys or even if they demonstrate on the street. And when elections are held, most of Israeli society is still right-wing, even if they distrust Netanyahu. So there's going to be a strong showing for right-wing parties, even if they're not Netanyahu. And then after elections, Netanyahu, because of the coalition system and the fragmented party system, is also a master at re-engineering his political options. So that's the main reason why a majority of people who may not trust him can't automatically get rid of him. And the next elections are far away anyway. They're only scheduled for late 2026. In terms of the people who support him, he has a stalwart basis. I would say the government itself, the whole government, the original parties that formed the coalition in late 2022, they have a very strong core support from the ultra-Orthodox, from many of the national religious community. The majority of them will support this government, did support one of the parties in the coalition. And then there's a core group who supports Likud itself, traditional Likud voters for generations. And so that adds up regularly to about a third of the Israeli public. Now, there's another measure, which is whenever public surveys ask, who do you trust more, or who do you think is best suited to be prime minister? And those surveys usually test Netanyahu against one other candidate. Sometimes it's the head of the opposition, Yair Lapid. Sometimes it's the person who's the front runner right now, Benny Gantz, or the theoretical Naftali Bennett, who we all know or think we know is going back into politics soon. And so every time that's asked, at this point, Netanyahu is mostly coming out first. Sometimes Naftali Bennett is ahead of him, but he generally gets in the higher 30% range. When it comes to the individual choice about who is the best possible prime minister, you have an additional portion who still think Netanyahu is better than the alternatives. It can range from 5%, 6% more than the original basis for the government, or maybe even up to the 41%, 42%. But those are people who probably, if you ask them, what we hear in regular conversations is they say, well, Netanyahu's problematic, but there's nobody else. It's the kind of thing that people have been saying, frankly, for the last 10, 15 years.
A lot of these trends were underway before the October 7th attacks. As you noted, Israelis were protesting starting January 2023. How did the October 7th attacks change this dynamic?
Well, it's a very interesting pattern. What we see in most other countries when a war breaks out, especially a war that starts in this way with such a devastating attack on your society, is generally people rally together and support for everything to do with the state goes up. The government gets a huge boost of support. Think of after September 11th, support for George W. Bush in the US, or support for Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine after Russia invaded. We had the opposite effect in Israel. The first thing that happened after the war, after October 7th and Hamas's attack, was a crash in support, both for Netanyahu personally, for his party, and for his government. And levels of trust, even in a generic way, just plunged. I could cite the numbers from all of these indicators, but one of the most interesting ones was that very question I talked about before. Who's most suited to be prime minister? Netanyahu fell 20 points behind every other candidate who was tested. And that's a very unusual outcome, in the early phase when people are deeply, deeply kind of clinging together. And there was a rallying effect that you saw in survey research and on the streets of Israeli society for itself. The level of social solidarity went through the roof among Jews, among Arabs, among everybody. But for the government, it crashed. However, that lasted for about 6 solid months with these very, very low ratings for everything to do with the government, its positions, its electoral support, et cetera. And then over the course of the spring and second half of 2024, the government was able to regain much of what it lost in those early months of the war. And the government made the decision to have a serious escalation against Hezbollah and Hamas, of course, assassinating Ismail Haniyeh in Iran, which was considered bold, daring, successful. All of those things together, including the escalations directly with Iran, led to a recovery of support for the government as Israelis began to perceive that the country was behaving in ways that demonstrated its strength and its the sort of Israel is back power in the region. There were some other reasons, but for whatever the actual reason, the government did regain its position that it was in pretty much before the war. In practice, the government is actually even bigger than it was before because it brought back an erstwhile splinter party from Likud. The current foreign minister, Gideon Sa'ar, kind of merged himself back into the government and then into Likud as well. So what you have now is a very strong coalition, but in survey research, in terms of public sentiment, it still does not enjoy majority support, but it has recovered some of what it lost in the early phase of the war.
How does the war fit into Netanyahu's political strategy, and how does Netanyahu's political strategy fit into the war?
I think when there is a tendency of analysts, and certainly a tendency of the Israeli public, as I mentioned, to perceive Netanyahu as making his wartime decisions based on his political strategy. I cannot prove if that's the reason, right? Because you have also the strong minority who are convinced that he's making his wartime decisions purely for the purposes of Israeli security and sustainability and maybe expansion, which is one of their goals. I can tell you that the circumstantial evidence and claims that he is making wartime decisions as part of his political strategy, the logic behind that claim is that his coalition partners, particularly the parties of Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, religious Zionism and Jewish power, respectively, which are fundamentalist, Jewish fundamentalist extremist parties, they deeply oppose ending the war because they ultimately want to annex Gaza and rebuild Jewish settlements there. They see it as correcting a historic and cosmic sort of a theological, deep, egregious error of Israel having withdrawn its settlements in 2005. And I think that they see this war in a way as a sort of miraculous sign from the heavens that Israel is destined to recontrol that territory. They basically say as much. We have a minister, Orit Struk, who said we're living in a time of miracles at one point. And there's no question that that is their aim. They have said time and again, and they have demonstrated that they are serious on this, that they will bolt from the coalition and could topple the government if they believe the ceasefires will become permanent and that the war would end. They would protest that by toppling the government. What we also saw was when this current hostage deal was established in mid-January, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the head of the Jewish Power Party, did bolt from the coalition. He made good on that threat. And the other one, Bezalel Smotrich, who's the finance minister and also a minister within the Ministry of Defense, stayed in the government, but essentially with an ultimatum, saying, if we don't restart the war, I will then break up the government. And at that point, the government would have fallen. And I think for that reason, whether or not I can claim to be inside Netanyahu's head, it was a pretty fair analysis at the time, even in January, that that deal was never going to move into phase two, which would have included a permanent ceasefire. I'm sorry to have been right, tragically sorry, because, the day after the deal was signed, it was clear to me, and I wrote this in my analysis, that the deal was destined to collapse and not reach the second phase, and that's exactly what happened. So do we know for sure that Netanyahu is making these political strategic calculations instead of actually thinking what's good for the country and good for bringing the hostages back? No, I can't prove what's going on in his head. But if you piece those things together, it seems like a very logical connection, and that's certainly what the Israeli public thinks.
So you start off by talking about the various challenges to Netanyahu's challenges to the rest of the system. There's the issue of the Shin Bet head, who he's been trying to dismiss. They're trying to get rid of the attorney general. There are the bribery cases that are moving forward. There is the prospect of new elections in 2026 at the end of the year. Several months ago, there was a sense that maybe the government would collapse over an inability to pass a budget by April 1st. It seems to have gotten through that problem. But as we look forward over the next year or two, what are the kinds of things that could erupt and throw the plans off, and when should we expect them?
It's hard to know exactly what might topple the government, considering that the government is in a pretty strong position until the next scheduled elections of late October or November 2026. So the government, as you point out, has passed a number of the major hurdles. So far, it has not collapsed over the issue of the ultra-Orthodox draft law, which is still looming. And it has passed the budget, and it got through the first tumultuous phase of the war when there was a lot of reason to think that the government could not withstand the public pressure, but it did. We are also speaking on a day when Netanyahu is actually being investigated for yet a new possible scandal. And I think commentators have called it a rolling scandal. The accusation is that country of Qatar had been paying some of his own advisors in the prime minister's office to do a kind of positive PR campaign at a time when Qatar is certainly playing a mediator role in the hostage release negotiations with Hamas, but also is being accused of having funded Hamas for all these years, which Netanyahu is accused of having allowed and maybe even midwives. And there's a lot of secrecy over the investigation because it's partly under a gag order. But the basic accusation is that employees of the prime minister, his close associates, his spokespeople, were actually taking money from an enemy country to advance its own good image. And this is a kind of an infiltration of Qatar into the Israeli government. So these are serious investigations, and the prime minister is at this minute being investigated as we speak. So that's another issue that is brewing, and I think it's very hard to say how that will play out. And what it will mean, it might not come to anything like an indictment against him, or it could. We just don't know. It's too early in that process to say. There is still the issue of the ultra-Orthodox draft law, which the Supreme Court has ordered the government to pass a law that meets the standards of equality in Israeli society in terms of equal obligations. But, of course, the coalition partners, primarily the ultra-Orthodox parties, and to some extent the religious Zionist parties, are dead set against any law that would really have teeth in terms of drafting mass numbers of ultra-Orthodox into the army. And this is also, frankly, just quixotic from the Israeli perspective, because we are embarking on something like a forever war and possibly the establishment of a military government over Gaza. Who is going to do all that if there's this constant deficit of both morale, but also manpower?
I know you pay a lot of attention to American politics as you're both an American citizen and Israeli citizen. There's been a lot of commentary in the United States about how the Trump administration is creating a crisis of democracy by asserting the strength of the executive over the judiciary. There certainly have been battles in Israel between the executive and judiciary. It's a little bit different because the executive comes out of a parliamentary majority. But as you think about the debates about the future of democracy in Israel, how much do they echo what you're reading about debates about the future of democracy in the United States?
I'm not sure how much it matters, but I think that the more fundamental thing is that Israel had much weaker or even missing pillars of its democratic structure in a way that is far more precarious than the American structure. And remember, it's not just that Israel doesn't have, the fact that Israel doesn't have a real separation between the legislature and the executive is a major issue. The executive has control over the legislature in Israel by institutional design, right? As you pointed out, it's a parliamentary system. But we don't have any of the normal additional checks and balances on executive power or even on the legislature. We don't have a federal system. We don't have regional representation. We are a single constituency proportional representation system. That means there's no local accountability. We don't have a presidential veto. We don't have a written constitution, a formal written constitution. Even Israel's basic laws, which are considered a stand-in for a constitution, have very precarious status. The basic approach for passing or amending even a basic law is simply a majority of those present in Knesset. So even the ones that are entrenched usually require just 61 out of 120 to change them. But there are very few that have a special entrenchment clause that require 2/3 of the Knesset to actually change them, 80 members of Knesset. It's very few of those laws, but one of those laws that is so entrenched is the date of the next election, of any given election. So that would be hard to change, but I have to tell you that there is already grave concern in Israel that somehow this government will try to postpone elections if they feel the need, if they think it's in their favor, to just not hold them anytime soon. Now, the parallel to that is Trump already talking about the possibility of trying to run for a third term. This is gathering momentum in the president's mind. This is what we've seen over the time since he's taken office. And even over the last few days, he's talked about it more seriously. So I think the starting point is different. There are far fewer pillars of democracy for Israel and Israel's practice, not unlike the US in its earliest phase. Israel as a country implemented deeply undemocratic practices such as martial law over its own citizens, not for a few hours like in South Korea, but for 20 years over 1/5 of its own citizens, and ongoing occupation ever since then over the Palestinians who are not citizens, but it's still a very undemocratic practice that implicates all Israelis who are involved in it. So there is both a missing foundation, an ongoing anti-democratic practice, in addition to strong democratic institutions and democratic practice. So it's a bit of a chaotic understanding of democracy. And then what you see is a real overdrive of an assault on those democratic institutions of the kind that we're talking about. I mean, if Israel were to just postpone the next elections, just as Trump is trying to sow the seeds of justifying a third term, which violates the US Constitution, that would be kind of bringing the assault to a new level. And I think they are emboldened by one another.
So let's say somebody's listened to your presentation and said, well, Dahlia has a lot of interesting points, but there's a lot out there. I can't pay attention to 17 things in Israeli politics. I can pay attention to maybe 1, 2, or 3. What are the most important signposts that people should be paying attention to?
The most important thing to keep your eyes on in terms of the direction of the country, which will influence both politics and democracy, et cetera, is annexation. Anybody who really wants to know the trajectory of Israel should look at how Israel is already annexing the West Bank in practice on the ground, and should look at how Israel is laying the groundwork for expelling Gazans in preparation for establishing a military government and some form of permanent control over Gaza. The groundwork being laid regarding annexation includes, for example, the establishment of an immigration authority and the legitimization of the idea through a kind of deceptive language by calling it emigration by choice or voluntary emigration for Gazans. But it's nothing less than driving people out due to wartime conditions that make it prohibitive to actually live there. And that is in preparation for Israel essentially expanding in a kind of empire fashion its permanent control over the West Bank and Gaza, while it does not plan to give citizenship to the subjects who live there, and making those regimes permanent. So that, of course, will mean that Israel cannot have a democratic system because it will have established permanent control in undemocratic authoritarian military regime over millions of people. But that doesn't trouble this particular government. And so then the inflection point really would have to do with the next elections. Will Israelis bring back parties that, even if they are right-wing, militant, hawkish, are committed on some level to this, at least, rebuilding, and hopefully rebuilding with a far stronger foundation, democratic institutions of the state? Or will elections either return Netanyahu to power and coalition partners who are not interested in preserving anything like a semblance of democracy or moving towards that, but are more committed to religious fundamentalism and territorial and imperial expansion? Sorry to use the cliche term, but I think that it does increasingly look like Israel's operating based on 19th century norms. Or if Israel just manages to get out of elections altogether. So those three pathways forward on the electoral level are the things that I would look out for.
Dahlia Scheindlin, thank you very much for joining us on Babel.
Thank you for having me.
With Israeli politics churning, what kinds of Israeli decisions would be likely to create a challenge for the White House? What kinds of opposition to Israeli policy might the U.S. mount?
Well, it feels to me like one of the main principles of President Trump's Middle East strategy is not to get sucked into a Middle East war. I could imagine a number of Israeli actions that could draw the United States into a Middle East war, most notably if there were an Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. What that would look like, whether the Israelis could really mount that on their own, whether the Israelis would coordinate with the United States and get a green light from the United States from that sort of action, I'm not really sure. But it strikes me that the answer could change over time. That on the one hand, the president wants to demonstrate a willingness, an openness to military action against Iran, but also suggest an openness to negotiation with Iran. It's quite possible the way this plays out is that the Americans are moving toward a negotiation with Iran. The Israelis are moving toward undermining a U.S. negotiation with Iran. And I could see Israeli actions that the president would say don't support the United States, they undermine the U.S. position. And things could potentially get messy if they went in that direction.
Yeah, I agree. To me, it seems that Iran is the biggest area for a potential rupture. I think domestically talking, it seems to me unlikely that actions Israel takes would cause real challenges for President Trump on the domestic scene in the US. I think the Republican Party is largely behind him and is going to support him. And ultimately, if the president says that actions Israel has taken are something that he agrees with, I think the Democrats may well try to object, but it's not clear to me what tools they would have to really constrain the United States government or to resist that. I do think there are steps that Israel can take that could cause other regional problems for the Trump administration, though. Clearly, the relationship with Saudi Arabia is something that President Trump cares a lot about. He's just announced that it's going to be his first international trip to visit Saudi Arabia, as it was in his first administration as well. And I think if Israel took some steps that really provoked the ire of Saudi Arabia, that could make that peace more difficult. Saudi Arabia could feel like it has to respond in ways that then work against the general strategy that President Trump is trying to put forward in the region, certainly pushing back the prospects for a normalization deal by some way. So I think perhaps regionally, the responses to Israeli actions might end up causing the Trump administration more problems than domestically here in the United States.
Scheindlin talked at the end about possible Israeli annexation of the West Bank and Gaza. What effects do you think that would have on the bilateral relationship?
It's a little bit hard to know exactly where the Trump administration would stand on this. As far as I'm aware, the only time that President Trump has been directly asked about his views on Israel annexing Gaza or the West Bank, he refused to answer. This was about a month ago, and he talked about how small Israel's territory is in the broader Middle East and how remarkable it is that Israel has achieved this success despite its very small position. But that non-answer is a kind of answer as well. This would be a huge departure from more traditional US policy on a two-state solution. And to me, it's difficult to imagine that full annexation could happen without some kind of green light from the Trump administration. Although, of course, as Scheindlin said, it could be a continuation of this more gradual process that's underway at the moment, rather than one dramatic decision and announcement. But I do think the effect of it would be to exacerbate the partisan divide that we're seeing in the US when it comes to Israel. This would be the death knell of a two-state solution, which, again, for decades has been US official policy. And I think Democrats would reject it very forcefully, more so than the Republican Party would. And then in terms of kind of what the effects would be, probably because of the way that the Democrat Party is likely to respond, we would see more calls for conditionality on US aid to Israel. I find it hard to imagine that that would happen under the Trump administration and when the Congress is controlled by Republicans. But it would probably also add to this general sense that Israel might not need US support. There's a growing wing in US politics, I think, that really does feel that support for Israel should be discussed and should be debated. There are even members of the Trump administration who have openly said this, although they don't seem to be ones who are the most prominent and in the most important positions in the administration. I think there could be a growing sense, sort of a bit further down the line, that this should be a debate that the US should have.
You know, it seems to me, I agree with a lot of what Will said, but it seems to me that the larger issue is, does the Trump administration have something else moving that an annexation would disrupt? The president has larger strategic issues, whether they're with the Gulf, whether they're with Iran, whether they're with other powers, and it's looking for successes, it's looking for wins. And to the extent that Israeli actions seem consistent with helping the president, I think he's likely to be accommodating and approving. But to the extent they seem to cut away from what the president's doing, undermine what the president's doing, he raised the risk of arousing the president's ire. My guess of the way this would unfold is that Israel would try to avoid doing anything that looked clear or sudden and would do things slowly and in an unacknowledged way that would create a different reality on the ground that would, I think, prevent a sharp response from the Trump administration. And I think it's also unlikely you get sharp resistance from the Trump administration to something that's gradual and not especially acknowledged.
Which, as Scheindlin said, is essentially what we're seeing now.
What will the general trends in Israeli politics mean for the bilateral relationship? What will matter 25 years from now?
Well, I think as Will said, you're seeing increased political polarization in the United States about Israel. I could imagine that growing. You still have a part of the Republican Party that has a trend toward isolationism, that doesn't want to get deeply involved in defending other countries. And I could imagine that Republican support for Israel would be somewhat splintered. Democratic support for Israel would be somewhat splintered. And what had been for several decades a remarkable bipartisan support for Israel could leave Israel as not only a divisive issue in American politics, but one which didn't easily split along Republican or Democratic lines. I think that the trend in Israel for some time has been to gain some degree of independence from the United States, some degree of not feeling like Israel is so reliant on the United States it has to follow U.S. diktats. So I think that is likely to continue, but I could certainly imagine a resumption of tensions between a more independent Israel, a more self-interested United States, when there's a sense that Israeli actions are undermining something the United States is trying to do, either in the Middle East or around the world. It does feel to me like this is not going to be a permanent mind meld between the United States and Israel, that we are increasingly moving toward an Israel that acts in its own interest, a United States that acts in its own interest. When they overlap, that's great. And when they don't, there will be significant tensions, and the Americans will remind the Israelis that it is as subject to American pressure as any country is. What effect that has on Israeli politics at the time it happens, I don't know. But it feels to me like this may be a more mature relationship and a more normal relationship.
There are so many other factors at play here. When we're talking about a span of 25 years, as you pose this question, I mean, just looking 25 years backwards, we had, well, even less than 25 years, but we had a US that was very confident in engaging militarily across the region, of course, most dramatically in Iraq, but also in Afghanistan. Obviously, now we're in a really different place in terms of US willingness to support engagement in conflict in the region. And it's difficult to know what the US role will be in the region 25 years from now. How does Israel's international isolation, or potentially growing international isolation, affect that? The changing relationship with Europe, which I think could continue to move in a worse direction, perhaps more quickly than with the US. How does Israel's relationship with China and with Russia change over these next 25 years? We've already seen, I think, Israel quite carefully nurturing ties with other powers to create a degree of independence while still fundamentally relying on the US. But those relationships could really develop depending on the broader balance of power in the region. And I think if that did happen, then that could create really different options for the United States going forward. So it's just very, very hard to know where things will be geopolitically around the world. If we see a much more isolationist US foreign policy, then I think that really changes Israel's options. So very difficult to say, but I do think there are the potentials for a more fundamental shift in the bilateral US-Israel relationship.
Jon, Will, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ninar.
Thanks, Ninar.
Thanks for listening to Babel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find more analysis on this topic linked in the show notes on the CSIS website, and you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.